"Excuse me, sir, that's not what he said." The words were soft, almost swallowed by the hum of polished air vents and the low clink of crystal glasses, but they stopped Ethan Nakamura cold just 3 steps from the boardroom door. For a moment, the entire 42nd floor of the Sterling Grand Hotel in Midtown Manhattan seemed to freeze with him. Ethan's hand remained on the brushed steel handle, his black wool coat hanging sharply over his shoulders, his jaw tight with the kind of disappointment that only came after wasting 3 hours on a deal that should have taken 20 minutes. A $300 million partnership with Hale Technologies had just collapsed, and as far as Ethan was concerned, the Americans had insulted him in the one way he never tolerated, by pretending to understand his culture while missing every word that mattered. Behind him, Victor Hale was still talking, his expensive smile stretched thin as he tried to salvage dignity from failure. "Mr. Nakamura, I assure you, this is just a misunderstanding." Ethan didn't turn around. He had heard enough misunderstandings for one day. But that voice again, small, steady, unmistakably certain, came from somewhere near the wall. "No, sir," the voice said. "It wasn't a misunderstanding." He asked for trust. "You answered with control." Ethan turned this time. Slowly. And there he was. A boy. Maybe 10 years old. Dark skin, neat braids pulled back under a faded navy cap, sitting cross-legged beside a janitor's supply cart near the marble wall. His backpack looked old, the seams stitched by hand. A thick library book rested open in his lap. Next to him stood a mop bucket and a yellow caution sign, the kind nobody noticed unless they slipped. Ethan stared. Victor laughed first, sharp and dismissive. "Whose kid is this?" A few people around the conference table chuckled nervously, eager to dissolve the tension. Near the doorway, Denise Brooks, the night custodian, dropped her cleaning towel and rushed forward, her face pale with embarrassment. "Caleb," she whispered sharply, reaching for his shoulder. "Don't interrupt grown folks." But Caleb Brooks didn't move. He looked directly at Ethan, not afraid, not arrogant, just certain. "The translator got it wrong," Caleb said quietly. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Across the room, Daniel Ross, the professional interpreter hired for the negotiation, straightened in his chair. "Excuse me?" Daniel said, his voice stiff. Caleb glanced at him, then back at Ethan. "When Mr. Nakamura said trust is the bridge before business, you translated it as control is the foundation of business. Those aren't the same thing." Silence hit the room like glass settling after a crack. Ethan's heartbeat slowed. That sentence had been spoken in Japanese. Fast. Subtle. Cultural. Not textbook language. Not something a child overheard by accident. Victor folded his arms, amused. "Kid, do you even know Japanese?" Caleb closed his book gently and stood up, his sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor. Then, in perfect Japanese, calm and clean as rain on glass, he answered Ethan directly. "No, sir. I know respect. Japanese just happens to be one of the ways to speak it." And just like that, Ethan Nakamura stopped walking away. The room stayed still for a long, heavy second, as if the walls themselves were trying to understand what had just happened. Ethan Nakamura did not blink. His dark eyes remained fixed on Caleb Brooks, studying him the way he studied numbers, contracts, and people worth remembering. Across the polished oak table, Victor Hale let out a dry laugh and loosened his tie, trying to break the tension. "Well, that is impressive," Victor said, his voice dipped in sarcasm. "A kid memorized a few phrases from cartoons. Cute." A few nervous smiles followed, thin and uncertain. But Ethan did not smile. He shifted his gaze toward Daniel Ross, the translator, whose face had lost its color. Daniel adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Mr. Nakamura, with respect, children repeat things they do not understand. Translation is more complex than vocabulary." Caleb's fingers tightened around the worn strap of his backpack, but his voice stayed calm. "It was not vocabulary," he said. "It was intention." Denise Brooks stepped forward quickly, her rubber-soled work shoes whispering against the marble floor. "Her cleaning." Gloves were still damp, and her breathing had gone shallow with panic. "Caleb, enough," she said softly, her eyes lowered. "Come on. We are leaving." Caleb looked at his mother, then at Ethan. "Mom, I am telling the truth." Ethan noticed something in that sentence. Not rebellion. Conviction. The kind that could not be taught. Victor rolled his eyes and poured himself water from the crystal pitcher at the table. "Mr. Nakamura, surely we are not letting a janitor's kid derail a business meeting." The words hung in the air, ugly in their simplicity. Denise froze. Her shoulders stiffened, but she said nothing. Ethan noticed that too. The silence of people who had heard those words before. Caleb lifted his chin. "I am not derailing anything," he said. "I am trying to fix it." Daniel leaned forward now, forcing confidence into his tone. "Mr. Nakamura, I translated your words accurately. I have 15 years of experience." Ethan finally spoke, his voice low enough that everyone leaned in to hear. "Then answer me this." He turned sharply into Japanese, his words fast, precise, layered with cultural nuance. "What does the proverb river before stone mean in negotiation?" Daniel blinked. His mouth opened slightly, but no answer came. Victor frowned. "What is happening?" Ethan ignored him. His eyes shifted back to Caleb. "You," he said, still speaking Japanese. "Answer." Denise's breath caught. Caleb hesitated for half a heartbeat, then answered in fluent Japanese, his pronunciation clean, natural, effortless. "It means patience moves first. Pressure comes second. If you start with force, you lose the river." Ethan's face gave nothing away, but something changed behind his eyes. Daniel swallowed hard. Victor stared at Caleb like the floor had tilted beneath him. The expensive boardroom, with its skyline view stretching 20 stories over Manhattan, suddenly felt smaller. Caleb was no longer invisible. Ethan stepped away from the door and back toward the table, setting his briefcase down with deliberate care. The deal was no longer dead. But now the real question had changed. Not whether the contract could be saved, but how a 10-year-old boy sitting beside a mop bucket knew more truth about the room than everyone inside it. Ethan Nakamura stood at the head of the table now, no longer halfway out the door, no longer finished with the room. The city lights beyond the glass walls flickered across his face, painting sharp lines over a man who had built an empire by recognizing value before anyone else could. But this was different. This was not market instinct. This was something stranger. Across from him, Daniel Ross sat stiff in his leather chair, fingers locked so tightly together his knuckles had gone pale. Victor Hale remained standing near the far end of the table, his polished shoes planted firmly, but the confidence in his posture had begun to crack. Denise Brooks stayed near the doorway, one hand gripping the handle of her supply cart as if it were the only steady thing left in the room. Caleb stood beside her, small against the wide boardroom windows, but somehow larger than before. Ethan folded his hands behind his back and spoke in Japanese again, slower this time, deliberate. "If trust is the bridge, what breaks it first?" Daniel answered immediately, forcing certainty into his voice. "Weakness," he said. Ethan's face did not move. Then Caleb answered. "Fear," Caleb said quietly. Ethan turned toward him. The room followed. Caleb swallowed, then continued, his voice stronger now. "Weakness can be forgiven. Fear creates distance. In business, distance kills trust." Ethan's eyes sharpened. That was not textbook language. That was understanding. Real understanding. Victor gave a dry laugh, trying to reclaim the room. "This is ridiculous. We are testing philosophy with a 10-year-old?" Ethan looked at him, and Victor's voice died instantly. Ethan turned back to Caleb. "Tell me," Ethan said in English now, "how did the translation fail?" Caleb glanced at Daniel, not with anger, but precision. "When you thanked Mr. Hale for his patience, the translator used a formal phrase that sounded cold. In Japanese, your words were humble. But the translation made it sound like you were measuring power." Daniel shifted in his chair. "That is interpretation, not error. Caleb shook his head. No, sir. In Japanese, humility is part of trust. If you remove humility, it changes the room. Silence. Even the air felt heavier. Ethan walked slowly back to the conference table and picked up the contract folder, flipping through the marked pages. The deal had fallen apart right after that exchange. Right after the translation changed the tone. Ethan stopped at one page and looked at Daniel. Did you translate the private Osaka clause? Daniel hesitated. Just enough. Caleb noticed first. He skipped part of it. Caleb said. Daniel snapped his head toward him. That is enough. Denise stepped forward immediately. Caleb, stop. But Ethan raised his hand gently, and Denise froze. Ethan's voice was calm. What part? Caleb took a breath. The part about family succession. Ethan's fingers tightened on the paper. That clause mattered more than price. It was the foundation of the entire partnership. Victor's smile vanished completely. For the first time all night, Ethan understood something dangerous. This was not just a bad translation. Something was missing. And somehow, the only person in the room honest enough to point at it was the boy nobody was supposed to notice. The silence in the boardroom sharpened like cold glass. Ethan Nakamura lowered the contract folder onto the polished table with slow precision, the sound of paper against wood cutting through the stillness. His eyes stayed on Daniel Ross. Read it, Ethan said. Daniel blinked. Excuse me? Ethan slid the page across the table and tapped the highlighted clause with one finger. The Osaka succession clause. Read it exactly as written. Daniel adjusted his glasses and forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. It is standard inheritance language. Nothing unusual. Caleb spoke before Ethan could answer. That is not true. Victor Hales slammed his palm lightly against the table, more from frustration than force. This has gone far enough. We are standing here letting a child challenge licensed professionals in a $300 million negotiation. Ethan turned his head toward Victor, his expression flat and unreadable. And yet, Ethan said quietly, the child is the only one who noticed the missing clause. Victor's jaw tightened. Across the room, Denise Brooks looked as though she wanted the marble floor to open beneath her. Her eyes moved from her son to Ethan, torn between fear and pride. Caleb took one careful step forward, his old sneakers barely making a sound. The clause says the partnership remains protected if leadership passes through family, Caleb said. That changes everything. Daniel laughed nervously. That is not relevant to the main agreement. Ethan's gaze darkened. In Japan, family continuity is never irrelevant. The room shifted. Even Victor understood that now. Ethan picked up the page and began reading it aloud in Japanese, his voice calm and exact. Then he stopped at the line Caleb had pointed out. He looked at Daniel. Translate it. Daniel hesitated. For the first time, the silence around him felt louder than speech. It means, Daniel began, that management remains stable. Caleb shook his head. No, sir. Everyone looked at him again. Caleb's voice was steady. It means the company trusts families, not temporary executives. It is about legacy, not management. Ethan stared at Caleb for a long moment. Legacy. That word mattered. It explained why the Osaka executives had grown cold halfway through the meeting. Why their faces changed. Why the trust in the room disappeared. Victor stepped in quickly, his smile thinner now. Look, maybe there was a nuance missed, but the deal can still be fixed. Let us not make this bigger than it is. Ethan's eyes shifted to Victor. Bigger? He repeated. You invited me here for trust. But your room was built on carelessness. Victor swallowed. Daniel leaned forward, desperate now. Mr. Nakamura, I assure you, there was no intention to mislead. Caleb looked at him carefully, then at the contract. Then why was that line marked in pencil? Every eye dropped to the page. Near the margin, almost invisible under the boardroom lights, was a faint graphite line beside the clause. A mark. Intentional. Ethan lifted the paper closer to the light, his jaw tightening. Victor's breathing changed. Daniel looked down. Denise covered her mouth slightly, stunned. Ethan placed the contract back on the table and looked at Caleb again, not like a child anymore, but like someone who had just changed the direction of the room. And for the first time that night, Ethan Nakamura was no longer asking whether the deal could be saved. He was asking who had tried to break it. Ethan Nakamura lifted the contract page closer to the light, the faint pencil mark catching against the glow of Manhattan's skyline behind him. It was small, almost invisible, but deliberate. The kind of mark someone made when they wanted to remember exactly where to bend the truth. The boardroom felt colder now. Victor Hale loosened his collar, his polished confidence beginning to slip. Daniel Ross kept his eyes down, his hands flat on the table like he was trying to steady himself. Caleb Brooks stood near the supply cart, his old backpack hanging from one shoulder, his breathing slow and even. Denise Brooks stared at her son as though seeing him in a room he was never supposed to belong in. Ethan placed the contract down carefully and looked at Daniel. "Who marked this?" he asked. Daniel swallowed. "I do not know." Ethan's voice stayed calm. "It is your translation copy." Daniel hesitated. "I review many drafts." Caleb looked at the page, then at Ethan. "That mark is beside the only clause about family trust," Caleb said. "That is not random." Victor stepped forward, his polished smile returning, thinner than before. "Mr. Nakamura, this is becoming unnecessary. A pencil mark means nothing." Ethan turned toward him slowly. "In business, details are everything." The words landed hard. Victor's face tightened. Ethan closed the folder and walked away from the table, but not toward the door this time. He walked toward Caleb. The sound of his leather shoes across marble echoed softly through the room. He stopped in front of the boy and looked down at the worn library book still tucked under Caleb's arm. It was a Japanese-English dictionary, old and repaired with clear tape along the spine. Ethan noticed handwritten notes in the margins. Careful notes. Study notes. "What did you learn?" Ethan asked. Caleb looked down at the book, then back up. "From my grandfather's books," he said. Ethan waited. Caleb shifted the strap of his backpack. "My granddad was stationed in Okinawa years ago. He brought home books. My grandma kept them. She taught me after school." Ethan's eyes moved to Denise. "And you let him study here?" Denise gave a small, tired smile. "At night," she said quietly. "When I clean these offices, he sits outside conference rooms and reads while I finish my shift." Victor laughed under his breath. "That is unbelievable." Denise straightened. Her voice was soft but firm. "It is true." Caleb glanced at his mother, then back at Ethan. "I listen," Caleb said. "People talk when they think nobody important is around." Ethan stared at him. "Nobody important." That phrase stayed in the room. Ethan understood it better than anyone there realized. He had built his first company in a one-bedroom apartment where nobody thought he mattered. He knew what invisible felt like. Daniel finally spoke, his voice tighter now. "Mr. Nakamura, this is all speculation. We still have a contract to sign." Ethan looked at him, then at the folder, then back at Caleb. Something had shifted. The deal was no longer the center of the night. Truth was. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver fountain pen, setting it beside the contract. "No signatures," he said. "Not until every word is clear." Victor's face went pale. Caleb looked at the pen, then at Ethan. And in that moment, Ethan Nakamura realized the boy with the taped dictionary and worn sneakers might be the only honest voice left in the room. The silver fountain pen rested untouched beside the contract, gleaming under the recessed lights like a promise nobody could reach yet. Ethan Nakamura stood at the end of the table, his hands in his coat pockets, staring at the pages in front of him with the stillness of a man recalculating everything. Across from him, Victor Hale shifted his weight, glancing at the skyline, then the clock, then Daniel Ross. Time was slipping. A $300 million agreement sat frozen over a few words, and somehow the room was now orbiting around a 10-year-old boy standing beside a yellow caution sign. Ethan broke the silence first. "Call Osaka," he said. Victor blinked. "Now?" Ethan looked at him. "Now." Daniel leaned forward. "It is almost 7 in the morning there." Ethan nodded. "Then they are awake." Victor forced a smile, but there was strain behind it now. "Mr. Nakamura, we can clarify tomorrow." Ethan's voice sharpened. "Trust delayed is trust weakened." That ended the discussion. Victor reached for the conference phone and dialed, his fingers slower than before. The speaker crackled once, then twice. Across the room, Denise Brooks quietly pulled Caleb closer to her side. "You have done enough," she whispered. Caleb shook his head slightly. "Not yet." Denise looked at him, confused by the certainty in his voice. The line connected. A calm voice answered in Japanese. It was Hiro Tanaka, senior partner of the Osaka firm. Ethan switched instantly into fluent Japanese, his tone respectful but direct. He asked one question. A simple question about the family succession clause. The answer came quickly. Clear. Undeniable. Caleb had been right. Ethan's eyes lowered for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he asked another question. Did you request this clause be softened in translation? A pause. Then Hiro answered, surprised. No. That clause was the heart of the agreement. Ethan looked at Daniel. Daniel looked down. Victor's hand slipped off the conference phone. The room changed again. Ethan thanked Hiro and ended the call. Silence returned, heavier than before. Daniel finally spoke, his voice thin. It was only meant to simplify the language. Caleb shook his head. Simplify and change are not the same. Victor snapped. Enough. His voice was sharp now, the polished mask finally cracking. He is a child. This deal is bigger than all of this. Ethan turned slowly toward Victor. No, Ethan said. This is exactly the size of the deal. Trust is built from details. Victor looked away. Ethan walked back to the table and opened the contract again, his finger stopping on another paragraph. Caleb leaned slightly, reading from where he stood. His eyes narrowed. There, Caleb said quietly. Ethan followed his finger. Another phrase. Another softened line. Ethan looked up. There are more. Daniel's breathing changed. Denise looked stunned. Caleb stepped closer to the table now, the old dictionary still under his arm, his eyes scanning the pages with focus far beyond his years. Ethan watched him carefully. Not as a child. Not as a janitor's son. But as someone who saw patterns everyone else ignored. Victor's face had lost all color. The deal was unraveling, but not in the way he expected. Ethan closed the folder again and looked directly at Caleb. Sit, he said, pulling out the chair beside him at the head of the table. Denise froze. Caleb looked at the empty leather chair, then at Ethan. Why? He asked. Ethan's answer was simple. Because if we are going to rebuild trust tonight, I need the only person in this room who has not lied to me. Caleb Brooks stared at the empty leather chair beside Ethan Nakamura as if it belonged to another world. The chair was oversized, polished, expensive, the kind meant for executives with corner offices and million-dollar decisions. Not for a 10-year-old boy wearing worn sneakers and carrying a taped-up dictionary. Denise Brooks stepped forward, her hand instinctively touching Caleb's shoulder. Sir, she said carefully, my son does not belong at that table. Ethan looked at her, calm and steady. Tonight, he said, he does. The words settled over the room with weight. Victor Hale turned away sharply, pacing toward the glass wall overlooking Manhattan. His reflection looked thinner now, less certain. Daniel Ross sat rigid, staring at the contract like it might save him if he looked hard enough. Caleb glanced at his mother. Denise gave him the smallest nod, the kind only a mother could give, carrying both fear and faith in the same breath. Caleb walked forward and climbed into the chair. The leather creaked softly beneath him, For the first time in his life, Caleb sat at a table built for power. Ethan opened the contract again and slid it toward him. "Show me," Ethan said. Caleb nodded and began reading. Slowly. Carefully. His finger traced each line, stopping at phrases that looked harmless to everyone else. But not to him. "This one," Caleb said after a moment. "It changes obligation into option." Ethan leaned in. He saw it immediately. A single word. Tiny. Dangerous. Victor turned back. "That is legal flexibility," Victor said quickly. Caleb shook his head. "No. It makes their promise optional." Ethan's eyes hardened. Another fracture. Another piece of trust bent out of shape. Caleb kept reading. The room had changed completely now. The boardroom was no longer a battlefield between companies. It had become a search for truth, and somehow the smallest person there was leading it. Ethan asked another question in Japanese, this time more personal. "When did you begin studying?" Caleb answered without hesitation. "When I was 6. Ethan tilted his head. "Why?" Caleb looked down at the dictionary under his hand. "Because words matter." Ethan waited. Caleb continued. "My grandfather used to say if you understand someone's language, you understand their heart faster." Ethan went still. That was an old truth. A real truth. Not business school language. Family language. Across the table, Daniel's breathing grew uneven. His fingers tapped once against the wood, then stopped. Ethan noticed. Caleb noticed too. Caleb's eyes moved to Daniel's briefcase on the floor. The zipper was half open. Inside was a second contract folder. Caleb frowned. "Why do you have 2 versions?" The question landed like a dropped glass. Daniel froze. Victor turned fast. Ethan's gaze dropped to the briefcase. Daniel reached for it too quickly. Too nervous. Too late. Ethan stepped forward and lifted the folder before Daniel could stop him. Inside was another copy of the agreement. Cleaner. Different. Ethan flipped to the same clause. The original wording was there. Untouched. Honest. Ethan looked at Daniel. "Explain." Daniel's face strained. Victor's jaw tightened so hard it looked painful. Caleb understood first. "He changed it after," Caleb said quietly. Ethan's eyes moved from Daniel to Victor. The silence between them said more than words could. Someone had planned this. Carefully. Quietly. But now the plan was breaking apart under the weight of one honest voice and one old dictionary sitting on a polished table where it was never supposed to be. Ethan Nakamura held the second contract in his hands, the untouched version heavier now than paper had any right to feel. The original clause was there, clear and intact, every word exactly as Osaka intended. No softened language. No hidden shifts. No broken trust disguised as convenience. The truth sat in plain ink. Across the table, Daniel Ross looked like a man who had run out of places to look. Victor Hale stood frozen by the window, the city lights behind him turning his reflection into something fractured. Caleb Brooks stayed seated beside Ethan, his small hands resting on the table near the old dictionary, his eyes moving carefully between the adults. Denise Brooks stood at the edge of the room, still holding her cleaning towel, her heart pounding so hard she could almost hear it over the silence. Ethan placed both contracts side by side. "One honest," he said. "One altered." His voice was low, but every word landed hard. Daniel finally exhaled. "It was not supposed to hurt anyone." Ethan looked at him sharply. "Then why hide it?" Daniel swallowed. His eyes shifted toward Victor for less than a second, but it was enough. Caleb saw it. Ethan saw it too. Victor stepped forward immediately. "Do not look at me like that." Ethan's voice stayed calm. "Then help me understand." Victor rubbed his forehead, the smooth confidence gone now. "The Osaka clause gave too much future control to your family line," Victor said. "Our investors wanted flexibility." Caleb frowned. "So you changed trust into profit." Victor looked at him, annoyed. That is business. Caleb shook his head. No. That is fear. Ethan went still again. The same word Caleb had used before. Fear. Not weakness. Fear. Ethan understood now. Victor had not wanted partnership. He wanted leverage. Daniel had only been the hand holding the pen. Ethan closed both folders and stared at Victor. You asked me for loyalty while building escape routes. Victor's voice tightened. I was protecting my company. Ethan's answer came without hesitation. By proving I could never trust it. The room fell silent again. The city outside glowed through the glass like distant fire, but inside the boardroom everything had gone cold. Then Ethan did something unexpected. He turned to Caleb. What would you do? Caleb blinked. Sir? Ethan leaned back in his chair. If trust was broken, but the opportunity still mattered. What would you do? Denise looked stunned. Victor looked insulted. But Ethan waited. Caleb thought for a moment, his fingers brushing the worn edge of his dictionary. Then he answered. Start over. Ethan studied him. Caleb kept going. Not because the money matters. Because truth matters first. If you rebuild from truth, the deal can survive. If you build from lies, it falls later. Ethan stared at him, hearing something rare in those words. Wisdom without ego. Truth without strategy. The kind adults spent decades trying to recover after losing it. Ethan reached for the conference phone again. Victor frowned. Who are you calling now? Ethan looked at him. Osaka. Victor stepped forward. At this hour? Ethan's hand hovered over the buttons. This time, he said, glancing at Caleb beside him, we start over with the truth. And for the first time all night, Caleb Brooks understood something powerful. He had not just stopped a bad deal. He had changed the shape of what came next. The conference phone rang only once before Hiro Tanaka answered again, his voice calm despite the early morning hour in Osaka. Ethan Nakamura spoke first, his Japanese clear and stripped of all ceremony. He apologized. Not for the delay, not for the confusion, but for allowing trust to be handled carelessly under his watch. Across the room, Victor Hale stood stiff and silent, hearing the weight of humility in a language he did not understand. Caleb Brooks sat beside Ethan, his eyes fixed on the contract, his small fingers tracing the worn tape on his old dictionary like it was something grounding him in a room too big for a boy his age. Ethan explained the altered contract, the hidden revisions, and his decision to reject every modified page. There was a long silence on the line. Then Hiro spoke. His voice softened. Ethan translated into English for the room. He says trust can be rebuilt if honesty comes first. Victor exhaled sharply, but Ethan raised his hand, stopping him. Hiro continued, and Ethan listened carefully. Then Ethan smiled for the first time that night. Small. Real. He turned to Caleb. He wants to know who caught it. Caleb froze. Denise tightened her grip on her towel, her eyes wide. Ethan answered in Japanese. A boy sitting beside me. Hiro laughed gently through the speaker. Then he said something longer. Ethan listened, then translated. He says wisdom does not measure height. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Lighter. Cleaner. Ethan ended the call and closed both contracts. Osaka agrees to restart negotiations tomorrow, he said. Victor stepped forward immediately. Tomorrow? Ethan looked at him. Without you. Victor's face emptied. You cannot be serious. Ethan stood. Trust is expensive. Tonight proved you could not afford it. Victor looked at Daniel, but Daniel had nothing left to offer. The room had chosen truth, and there was no way back through it. Victor grabbed his coat and left without another word, the glass door shutting softly behind him. Daniel followed, quieter, smaller somehow. And then it was just Ethan, Caleb, and Denise in the giant boardroom above Manhattan. The city looked different now. Less distant. Ethan turned toward Denise. Your son saved my company tonight. Denise shook her head quickly. He just reads too much. Caleb smiled faintly at that. Ethan looked at the dictionary on the table, its spine bent, its pages crowded with handwritten notes. No, Ethan said softly. He listens too much. That is rarer. Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out a business card, placing it in front of Caleb. There is a language academy in Boston. One of the best in the country. I fund part of it. Denise stiffened. Sir, we cannot take charity. Ethan nodded. He respected the answer. But Caleb looked at his mother, and then at Ethan. What if it is not charity? He asked. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Caleb placed his hand over the dictionary. What if it is an investment? Ethan stared at him, then laughed quietly. A real laugh this time. Denise looked at her son, pride shining through tired eyes. Ethan slid the card closer. Then I would say it is the smartest investment I have seen all year. Outside, the lights of New York stretched for miles, glowing against the dark. Like promises waiting to be kept. And at a table built for power, beside contracts worth millions, an old taped-up dictionary sat between a billionaire and a boy, proving that sometimes the smallest voice in the room carried the greatest truth.